All right. So we've talked a lot about kind of the different aspects of sleep, starting with stress and how the cortisol hormones can impact the level of melatonin and also our cycles. And then the following weeks after, we talked about calibrating our body cycles to making sure that your sleep and everything else that the body is governed to do is working at the time it's supposed to be doing. Then we talked a bit about mood, and we're going to touch base again about mood because there's that one important slide that I really want to go back to. But we don't just make melatonin out of the blue. We make it through a series of pathways and products, and we'll learn again what that is. And then we learned a bit about the power of melatonin last week, and that had to do with what melatonin really does. And there's a lot of things we've only touched base on or more like we've only scratched the surface. So this is where we have to kind of come back in full cycle. And now that we've learned the context of sleep and the effects of what sleep can do for you, let's get on with the next week in actually helping. What other tips? We'll go back and cover the previous tips that we covered, but we're going to look into the many things that you could try. It's almost going to be like a menu, and you get to try what aspects that fit into your lifestyle and try them one by one, because there's quite a bit of it. So let's get things started. Welcome again, and welcome to Fix Your Gut, Fix Your Sleep. So, because this is an online presentation, any questions I ask that you leave to the end of the talk, or leave them in the chat box below, and I'll get to them when we get to the end. Just a little disclaimer that this is not meant to treat or diagnose anyone or treat you with the following supplements and nutrition that we're going to be talking about. If you believe that this is something that you have to work with, I suggest that you also bring this up to your healthcare practitioner, whether that be your GP, nurse practitioner, or naturopathic doctor. This presentation is not meant to suggest a cure or treatment. The intention is just to inform and educate. So again, my name is Dr. Romi Fung, and I am a practicing naturopathic physician here in Richmond, British Columbia, with a general practice at the Richmond Family Chiropractic. I do focus on my treatments with patients with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. I did my naturopathic medical education at the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine, and prior to that, did my pre-medical training at Simon Fraser University with a Bachelor's of Science in Health Sciences. And I'm currently just completing my master's right now at Queen's University in Aging and Health, and will be expected to complete that by the end of August. But amongst my master's and graduate education, I conducted some research to do with curcumin and the efficacy in Alzheimer's disease, and we'll be formulating that in a future talk sometime. But I'm hoping to bring forth that into more future studies along the road. So what I do as a naturopathic doctor is finding pretty much what is going on. There's more to it about things. So in the context of this, there's more to it than telling you what to take to help your sleep. I want to find out why your sleep is interrupted and what can be causing those interruptions. Many things can be possible at first. We've talked a lot about certain aspects of sleep or certain aspects of your lifestyle that can contribute to sleep, such as lack of light, especially in the morning, to tell your body, well, it's daytime now, especially with the differences in the light reading called lux, where you get about no more than 1,000 lux from your LED lights, but you get up to 100,000 lux by getting direct sunlight. And if you are not getting that direct sunlight, especially in the morning, then your body's not getting the right signals. Other things can be a lack of magnesium, pain, anxiety, etc. And this requires a thorough investigation of your health history to really find out what can be contributing to your complaints of sleep. So I'm hoping that with these talks that it fulfills my mission. And my mission right now is to empower those in this challenging time by educating you and the community on your body and your health. So with that being said, why don't we get started? So I would like to get started with just this quote. The food that you eat can dramatically impact the quality of sleep that you get. Does this sound like a fair statement to you? A lot of people would think, well, I thought eating only affects, our digestive tract and we get energy from that. But are things that we're actually putting in our mouths affecting our sleep? Well, potentially. You can probably think of the most basic things, such as coffee, that can affect your alertness. But what about foods and other aspects of our digestive tract that can really improve on our sleep? Remember, food is not just food, it's information. The types of food that you eat, along with the nutrients that they have or contract or even lack of, can automatically incite processes that determine what the body, health, sleep, and your DNA will be like. So think about the next time you take a bite out of anything. It's not that it's just going to go out the other end. You extract nutrients. And it's those nutrients, whatever kind of quantities that come out of that food, can elicit cascades of responses down the road in your body. And that leads to your body responding and reacting to whatever levels or lack of that you have with these nutrients. So I want to get back to this one slide here, and I want to ask you again, for those of you that celebrate Thanksgiving, has anyone ever had turkey? And after having turkey, they felt really sleepy. This has to do with this basic cascade, starting with something called tryptophan. And we know that tryptophan is quite heavy in turkey, but also other protein sources. So it's not just turkey, but in fact, tryptophan is in everything. When you think about protein, as long as you have a complete protein source, you're going to have varying levels of tryptophan along with the other amino acids that build protein. But we talk about tryptophan specifically because it's tryptophan that helps develop and is in the process in our bodies to produce something called 5-HTP. So our body can convert tryptophan into something which we might have noticed in a lot of supplement stores or supplement bottles. And it's 5-HTP that we can convert then to something called 5-HT, or we know it as commonly as serotonin. And we know that serotonin is the feel-good hormone. If you're not really high on serotonin, well, a lot of people tend to have those kind of mood swings. First, serotonin is a neurotransmitter, and that is largely associated with not just the mood, but also our sleep, appetite, and other regulatory functions in the body. We've already kind of found links that reduced levels of serotonin are connected to depression and anxiety. And it's through serotonin then that can be converted to melatonin. So without having sufficient levels of serotonin, how are you able to produce melatonin? And we know that people with low serotonin levels also tend to spend less time in restorative, non-rapid eye movement REM sleep over the course of the night. You might even have a question thinking, but I know someone who's probably depressed And if you're saying that serotonin is low in them, why are they sleeping so much? Well, they can be sleeping a lot, but their melatonin may not be as optimal, and thus that sleep may not be regenerative and restful. So we know that serotonin plays that really important role in the body, in our sleep, because it helps synthesize melatonin. And we know that melatonin is produced at night and plays a fundamental role in regulating our body's biological clock. In fact, melatonin does govern our sleep and wake cycle, whereas serotonin is more involved in wakefulness, but can also be contributive in triggering sleep, especially rapid eye movement sleep. This is when you start dreaming. So with this pathway, it's not just by having the building block. So by having tryptophan that can produce 5-HTP, and by having 5-HTP that you can produce melatonin, there are something called cofactors. These are things that you need in order to help convert them. So in order to convert tryptophan to 5-HTP, we need something called 5-MTHF, so methyl tetrahydrofolate, or in other words, the active form of folic acid. I had to think about that for a second, or else I'm going to think of some other word that is not to be said in video. And also you require calcium and vitamin D3. And then you need something to convert 5-HTP, and that requires zinc, magnesium, vitamin B5, and vitamin C. And then in order to convert serotonin to melatonin, you again need more of the methylating factors. So the methyl tetrahydrofolate, something called SAMe, and you also have P5P. These are all aspects of methylation, and we didn't really touch base much on methylation, but what it really is it's just attaching and removing something called a methyl group. It's kind of like a pin, but it's in the body, it's a type of signal, and it's a signal to either turn on or turn off pathways, including DNA. So most commonly, especially in this case, I think of magnesium, only because when you're stressed, we need to use magnesium, or in other words, we actually use up more magnesium because magnesium helps prevent that physical tension. When you're stressed, you might feel that your body starts to tense up, and it's magnesium that really helps relax it. So the more you tense up, the more the body has to utilize that magnesium to help relax. But magnesium isn't just to help relax the muscles. It also is it's involved in a lot of processes, as many as 500 different processes in the body. And so if you use up magnesium just to help relax the muscles, well, it's gonna use up and down-regulate other aspects that magnesium is required. So that's where we look down and we get to melatonin. But first off, we know that melatonin stems from serotonin. So melatonin is made from serotonin. But here's the next major question that you want to be thinking for yourself. Where is serotonin made? Think about it. Where do you think serotonin is made? Now, if this was an actual live audience, I would be looking at your faces and seeing people thinking, have I ever thought about this? And we're finding that it's actually in the gut. We're finding more evidence that the gut has a big involvement in a lot of our brain physiology. Something called the gut-brain axis. And for those of you that have attended quite a few of my talks on the gut-brain axis, there's a lot to it. But we're starting to find that our gut is what we call our second brain. Not only does our gut have bacteria that can really help with a lot of our brain kind of functions. In fact, have you ever had those moments where you're just about, actually, why don't I put you in the seat? Imagine if you're me right now and you're doing this talk to 20 plus other people, or maybe even live talking to up to 60 people. How would you feel? Especially if you haven't had much of the experience doing talks. I would expect you to be feeling quite nervous. Maybe I'm still nervous right now. But when you feel nervous, we have these kind of sayings about this nervousness. One of the most common ones is having butterflies in your stomach. You're so nervous that you feel that flutter that's going on in the gut. But we're connecting, something physical like our gut to our mind, which is our anxiety. So are you saying that there is that connection? Well, let's say there is that connection and that we can make that connection now onto sleep. But did you know that despite knowing that the gut produces or helps produce serotonin that we're going to find in the next few slides, we actually have melatonin also in our gut. But how much melatonin can be in our gut compared to where else in the body? When we think of melatonin, we probably think that it's produced in something called the pineal gland, that's in our brain that has to do with sleep. And in all fairness, yes, it is produced and synthesized in the pineal gland. But in the recent research in 2011, there are researchers that found that there's as much or as many as at least 400 times more melatonin in the gut than in the pineal gland. And that says a lot. So melatonin can be found in the lower gut, but in such increased amounts. So we find that there's actually certain studies that show bacteria that produce or modulate the production of serotonin, which can then be converted into melatonin. So there are quite a few recent studies that show that certain bacteria, when you have more of that in the gut, that you actually produce more of the serotonin. And then what's also quite interesting is that why is it producing serotonin and melatonin in the gut? And that's because there's more to it. As we learned last week, that there's more to it than melatonin just helping your sleep-wake cycle. There are a lot of receptors, so these are things that utilize melatonin that are found in the gut cells. So what we're saying, and we go back to our last couple of talks, is that everything in our body actually is regulated by a time cycle. So it's not just that I eat, an apple, and that at any point of the day, it's just, going down our esophagus, going into our stomach, going into our small intestine, get digested, get absorbed, and whatever does not get digested goes at the other end. We are technically that way, but we're not machines 24/7. So by having this finding, researchers are investigating and are suggesting that there are better times or more optimal times for certain physiological aspects. So what that means is there's specific times in the day, given that it's constant, that your body or different parts of the body work well. So we already know that our brain works well at night because one, we're utilizing that melatonin to get our brain to sleep, but two, our brains open up something called our glymphatics, and that helps with cleaning of the brain. And this only happens during the night. But if that happens during the night, there are other things in the body that should not be happening at the night. So that's one thing is likely digestion. If you're digesting food, you're going to need blood in the stomach and in the intestines to help digest it. And that reduces the blood in the brain that it requires in order to clean. So this can go all over the place, but what I'm trying to say is that there are aspects of our body function that are more active at different times of the day. And if you respect those times, then it's going to perform at its most optimal. So, and how is it then if serotonin and melatonin is produced in the gut? How is it then that the body gets that to the brain? And that has to do with something called the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is this long nerve that runs from the brain all the way to the rest of the organs that you don't have to control consciously. So it's the brain that then controls, your digestion and so forth. That's what the vagus nerve actually kind of suggests. Also, we have something called rest and digest, hence why you see this relaxation techniques. By relaxing, you're allowing the body to then get to a state of parasympathetic. And it's this parasympathetic, the rest and digest state, which then allows the body to then work its magic through the vagus nerve to get your digestion going. But then your vagus nerve, even though it comes from the brain down to the gut, actually works the other way around too. So here, 90% of vagus nerve fibers can actually send signals up to the brain in relation to your hunger, fullness, inflammation, and even that sending of the signal of serotonin and melatonin. Another signal that we talk about in our gut-brain axis is something called butyric acid, butyrate. It's a very short chain fatty acid that has been linked to the production or from the production of gut bacteria and utilized more so along the body, including the brain. So what about the other way around then? So we know that the bacteria can affect our body and specifically our sleep in this case, but can it go the other way around? And we're actually seeing evidence that good bacteria can help with sleep, but what about bad sleep? So there's a study done in 2017 looking at people that cross the international date line, so crossing time zones, and looking at the so-called jet lag and its effect on the gut bacteria. And they find that those that are jet lagged show an increase of strains of bacteria. So these are different types of bacteria that are actually more common in obesity and diabetes. It's quite interesting. So are you saying that by crossing the time zone that our gut bacteria also gets affected? Potentially, especially if you get to that jet lag state and you have to bring yourself back. Of course, these changes are not permanent given that you take an active role in it. But we find that with this research that your gut bacteria changes when you become jet lagged. And when you become jet lagged, well, you're not sleeping quite well. There's a pattern here. I mean, if you're not sleeping well, that affects the gut microbiome. And in turn, that affects our serotonin and melatonin production. And that means if you don't have enough of that serotonin and melatonin, then you can't sleep even better. It's almost like a ripple effect. See the cycle that's going on? Then there are other research studies that show that there's other parts besides serotonin and melatonin that we know that the bacteria can produce that can also support sleep. There are other species that produce something called gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA. And you're thinking, GABA? I've heard of GABA, and I take it to calm myself down. Well, yes, GABA is a very calming amino acid, and it's a neurotransmitter that really promotes sleep. So they're finding that the gut bacteria doesn't just help sleep through the production of serotonin and melatonin, but also production of GABA. And then at the same time, in another series of studies, there's something called IL-6. And IL-6 is a message in your immune system that regulates inflammation. So if your IL-6 is high, then technically you're quite inflamed. And what this research finds is that IL-6 is regulated, meaning it's controlled, when you have the proper gut bacteria. So if you're not having good amounts and equal amounts of good bacteria, or let's say good amounts of good bacteria versus bad bacteria, then you're going to get to a point where you're not producing, chances are you're not likely producing the serotonin, melatonin, or in reduced amounts, GABA that could help relax and promote sleep, and you're likely inflamed. That's kind of, to me, that's sounding like a triple whammy or a quadruple whammy right there on just gut bacteria and sleep itself. So what is the bottom line then? Well, when we think about ways to help sleep, we think of foods that can, help with sleep. You might have heard, me saying last week that I said, yeah, cherries have more melatonin, and that could also help. But rather than taking exogenous, so these are things that are produced outside the body, so like your supplements, rather than taking, your so-called melatonin supplement, we also got to help our body thrive and promote its own production of melatonin, and also help our gut microbiome to thrive to promote our own sleep. So that requires a lot of things to do with our lifestyle habits. Of course, that's along with having good habits of sleep. So we need to find ways that we can feed the microbiome. Now, this doesn't mean you should start gobbling down yogurt or popping probiotic pills, because many of these supplements are quite different, and the strains can be very different too. And it's not really, to me, a matter of giving your body the bacteria, because bacteria can thrive, grow, and divide. But in order for it to thrive, grow, and divide, it needs a proper environment. So if if you have gut bacteria, but it doesn't thrive in your gut, it's not going to survive. So we need to start looking at things that provide that environment. So rather than on the first of our list, probiotics, we want to think about prebiotics. And what is a prebiotic? Well, that's food that feeds the probiotic. And what foods feed probiotics? Well, first thing I think of is fiber. When we think of fiber, we think of that intestinal transit. We take fiber to help our poop, to help us poop and go to the bathroom. And that's one thing about it. But it's fiber that these good bacteria thrive on. And by not having a proper amount of fiber, your chances are you're likely constipated and you're not feeding the gut bacteria. And here's a double whammy here. If you're not feeding the gut bacteria, it's probably not going to provide you with certain signals, including the serotonin and melatonin, that could also signal for proper functioning of your digestive tract. So that's something to think about. Reducing sugar, because sugar feeds the bad bacteria and not the good. And you don't want to have the bad bacteria overpopulate the good. Sleep is probably the time for the gut bacteria to function. And we know through a couple studies that sleep in terms of the jet lag can really affect the levels of the gut microbiome, and also the quality and the variability, the variety of the different strains of the gut bacteria. And one thing that has been shown to be really helpful, and we actually go through this quite a bit in a different talk on the gut-brain axis, is exercise. They find that people who exercise on a daily basis, going on good walks or going through resistance training, etc., for a few days a week, they actually harbor good bacteria compared to those that are physically inactive. So think about the next time you exercise. I mean, going on walks. We just had some rain here in Vancouver, but the weather here in Vancouver has been quite beautiful, that I would be suggesting people to go on brisk walks now and then to really help. But thinking about not just getting your heart going, your blood flowing, utilizing your blood sugar, but now you know that exercise can really help with the gut microbiome. So we actually talk about this in our previous talk to do with mood, but having foods to really support the production of melatonin stems from making sure that we're producing enough serotonin. So this is where I go back to this slide again, where we have tryptophan, 5-HTP, serotonin, and melatonin, and looking at what supports the production of downstream to melatonin. So looking at the different sources of calcium. So it's not just going to be dairy. In fact, I might even say to err on the side of dairy, but to look into other really rich sources of calcium, including kale, collard greens, mustard greens, sardines, sesame seeds, sea vegetables. Those are also high in calcium. And to look into magnesium, these are things such as, I always say, dark chocolate, green leafy vegetables, pumpkin and sesame seeds. Spirulina also has magnesium. I think one individual brought up Brazil nuts having magnesium, and I had to double check because I know Brazil nuts are extremely high in selenium, which is also helpful. But you don't want to be taking too many Brazil nuts. In fact, no more than 3 or 4 kernels, because that puts you at about 400% of selenium consumption for the day, which can potentially lead to selenium toxicity if you do that on a chronic basis. But I had to check, and I found out, and this is something I learned from that talk, is that 4 kernels of Brazil nuts provide about 100 milligrams of melatonin, not melatonin, magnesium. So that was something that I learned. Then there's looking at, even just at the beginning here, tryptophan. You think of turkey, but there are other sources that are higher in tryptophan, and that includes chicken, eggs, sweet potatoes, chia seeds, hemp seeds, bananas. This is probably why people who wake up in the middle of the night, they feel better or their sleep gets better by having a banana. Pumpkin seeds, almonds, and leafy greens. So it's about supporting this pathway that then your body optimizes the production of melatonin given the right environment. So what do I mean by environment? Well, the right sunlight, making sure that you get sunlight, especially in the morning, because we learned through calibrating our body cycles that by having sunlight minimally at a minimum level of about 3,000 lux. So that's way much more than what any light bulb can provide, except for the specialized light bulbs for seasonal affect disorder. but sunlight, even on a cloudy day, can give a few thousand lux. And it's at least a minimum of 3,000 lux that can stimulate the production of serotonin. So giving your body the right environment is also crucial. There are other foods and nutrients that can also help promote sleep. One of them is omega-3s, and that comes from your fish oils, because we know that omega-3 helps the brain, especially DHA, which is one of the components of omega-3 fatty acids. And that comes from a lot of fatty fish, but also seeds like chia seeds. Of course, when you get them from chia seeds or any other sources of seeds, your body's actually getting something called ALA, and your body will need to convert that to EPA and DHA, but it doesn't actually convert that well. And that's why getting either a proper supplement or getting fish a couple times a week is probably your best likely thing to be getting your omega-3s. Then there are foods with melatonin. There are actually some foods out there that contain certain levels of melatonin, and one of the highest ones is, as I mentioned last week, tart cherries. Tart cherries have likely the highest amount of melatonin in foods, but then there are also other foods with smaller amounts of melatonin, including walnuts, ginger root, asparagus. And then there are studies that show that there are specific foods that help or have been found to help the body's production of melatonin. And one of them, as I mentioned, is the banana. So, in summary, we are host to gut bacteria, and I would be more than happy to share that with you in a future talk on the gut-brain axis. But we now know that it's the gut bacteria that really help support our process in producing serotonin and melatonin. And the key here is not to really replenish our gut bacteria. They can do that themselves, but we need to provide the environment that the bacteria can thrive in. So it's not really a matter of taking a probiotic. Of course, there are reasons that we take probiotics, which is perfectly fine. But if you're taking them and not providing the body with the right environment, it could likely be coming to waste. And there is evidence out there that a typical probiotic that you take may not actually last in the body for longer than 3 days. So is it because of the environment? Really depends. And that concludes my little short talk for this week. But just before we end and get to the Q&A, again, I'd like to remind you that I do have a Facebook page that if you have any questions that you're more than welcome to ask questions there, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. And also I provide a lot of posts reminding you about other talks and future talks. And we also have talks coming up, not just with the Richmond Public Library, that we'll be doing hopefully this for a while for a weekly basis, but I'm actually planning now with the community centers to be reopening sometime in the fall for specific talks. So, and that actually will be alerted through my Facebook page as well as through my Instagram. And I'll provide links also on my website, but for recordings like this one, you'll be able to find it through my social media and through my YouTube channel. So I'm going to stop there on finding the recording.